The rail line through occupied Poland cuts through morning fog like a scar across stolen land. Inside the wooden clinic near the tracks, nurse Irena Kowalska presses clean bandages against a partisan's wound, a man disguised as a farmer with a threshing accident. Outside, the rumble of freight cars echoes through the valley. Every night for 18 months, the Wehrmacht's supply trains have rolled east, packed with ammunition, fuel, and the kind of arrogance that comes from believing your enemy is beaten. They called the locals Bauern, peasants, farmers with pitchforks. Too terrified to resist, too simple to threaten the Reich's war machine. But now, something different. Major Kruger, the local Wehrmacht commander, has just approved a shipment of medical supplies to be transported alongside the munitions train. A humanitarian gesture, he thinks, to win hearts and minds. He has no idea he's just approved the delivery mechanism for his own destruction. What happens in the next 12 hours will shatter one of the Wehrmacht's most dangerous assumptions. That occupation had bred submission. That the nurse tending their wounded was only a nurse? That compassion and sabotage could never occupy the same heart. More than that, it will demonstrate something German intelligence had catalogued but never truly internalized. Polish partisans didn't just have courage or desperation. They had something far more dangerous: the ability to hide in plain sight, to weaponize the very mercy the occupiers dismissed as weakness. If you're finding this story compelling, hit subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. For 3 years, since the invasion of September 1939, German military intelligence had operated on a doctrine called Bandenbekämpfung, bandit fighting. The entire counterinsurgency strategy was built around a fundamental assumption: that partisan resistance was disorganized, desperate, rural, and primitive. Farmers attacking supply lines with stolen rifles and homemade explosives. Dangerous, yes, but predictable. The protocols were clear: heavy reprisals, collective punishment, public executions. Break their will, starve their resources. The idea that resistance could be intelligent, coordinated, hidden inside the humanitarian infrastructure itself. Inside hospitals, inside medical transports, inside the very nurses and doctors they forced to treat their wounded, seemed more paranoid than practical. This wasn't ignorance. German intelligence was thorough and professional. They knew partisan networks existed. They knew about underground cells, smuggling routes, sabotage attempts. They had the reports, the interrogations, the maps. What they didn't grasp, what they couldn't quite believe until it was too late, was the sophistication of the disguise. Polish resistance operatives weren't just hiding in the forests. They were standing in Wehrmacht medical tents. They were loading German supply wagons. They were being thanked by German officers for their service while planting the explosives that would kill them. The system worked like this: a nurse, trustworthy, essential, beneath suspicion, would request medical supplies through official Wehrmacht channels. Morphine, bandages, sterilization equipment. All approved, all documented. All transported alongside military cargo. Because, after all, what threat could a nurse pose? But hidden inside those medical crates, wrapped in gauze and marked with Red Cross symbols, were detonators. Fuse wire. Stolen explosives from German engineering depots, disguised as surgical instruments. The triggers themselves were often medical devices. Sterilization flames hot enough to light a fuse. Timers salvaged from broken clocks and passed off as equipment repair. This wasn't guesswork. This wasn't a farmer with a grudge and a bottle of petrol. This was infiltration made surgical. And the Germans, for all their intelligence gathering, for all their interrogations and reprisals and paranoid security protocols, had never quite internalized what this meant in practice. They had built a doctrine around crushing visible resistance. Partisan bands in the forests, underground newspapers, smuggling networks. But they had never seriously considered that the resistance might be invisible, that the woman changing their bandages might be the same woman mining their railway, that mercy itself could be a weapon. The preparation began 3 days before the train was scheduled to pass. Irina's clinic had become something German medical protocols never anticipated: a weapons workshop disguised as a mercy station. The transformation happened in the spaces between treatments, in the 5 minutes after a Wehrmacht corporal left with fresh bandages, in the hour before dawn, when curfew still locked the village in silence. On the first night, she inventoried her supplies with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. 20 meters of copper wire, salvaged from a bombed-out telephone exchange, now coiled inside a tin marked surgical sutures, sterile. 3 detonators, no larger than fountain pen caps, nested in a jar labeled morphine ampules, handle with care. The explosive itself, plastique stolen from a German engineering depot 6 weeks earlier, had been divided into portions small enough to hide inside rolled bandages. Each portion was wrapped in wax paper treated with camphor to mask the chemical scent. The Germans had approved her requisition for expanded medical supplies without hesitation. More supplies meant better care for their wounded. Better care meant gratitude. Gratitude meant compliance. The logic was ironclad. So was the trap. But the real engineering happened beneath the railway bridge. Jan Kowalski, the village blacksmith, no relation, though the shared surname had become a private joke, worked at night with tools that served 2 purposes. His welding torch, officially used to repair Wehrmacht vehicle axles, cut through the bridge's support beam housing to create a hollow space exactly 40 centimeters deep. The cut was surgical, nearly invisible, reinforced afterward with a thin plate that would hold under visual inspection but collapse under the explosive force they were preparing. Tomasz, the schoolteacher, brought his knowledge of mathematics. He calculated the blast radius, the optimal placement for maximum structural failure, the timing required for the fuse to ignite after the train's weight triggered the pressure mechanism. His classroom had been closed for 2 years. Teaching Polish history was now forbidden. But the formulas he'd once used to teach geometry now calculated destruction with the same methodical precision. Every evening, Irina treated German soldiers in her clinic. She cleaned wounds with the same careful attention she'd learned in nursing school. She administered morphine to men screaming from shrapnel injuries. She smiled when they thanked her in broken Polish. She documented everything in neat, precise German, each entry proof of her cooperation, each page another layer of cover. And beneath her examination table, wrapped in oilcloth and marked "Medical Waste, Incinerate," sat the final component. A pressure-release detonator that would arm itself the moment the train's weight compressed the trigger mechanism Jan was installing beneath the bridge. On the 3rd night, a German medic named Klaus, young, homesick, grateful for her patience with his terrible Polish, helped her load medical crates onto the supply wagon. He didn't know that 2 of the crates contained everything needed to turn a railway bridge into a crater. He handed her a box marked with a red cross, commented on how heavy the new bandages were, and joked that the quartermaster must be padding the shipments. Irina smiled, thanked him, watched him secure the cargo straps with the kind of thoroughness that would ensure the explosives arrived intact at the railway junction. The Wehrmacht had trained him to be careful with medical supplies. That care would kill him and 200 others. She returned to her clinic that night and sat in the dark for 20 minutes, her hands shaking, her medical oath, "First, do no harm," echoing against the memory of her village burning, of her neighbors executed for hiding a Jewish family, of children orphaned by an empire that called mercy weakness. The oath still mattered, but so did the train. And in occupied Poland, healing and killing had become 2 edges of the same blade. Dawn came wrapped in fog so thick, the railway bridge disappeared 20 meters from where Irina waited. She sat on her medical wagon at the prescribed location. A supply checkpoint 300 meters from the bridge, close enough to seem plausible, far enough to survive what was coming. Her papers identified her as a civilian medical courier authorized to transport equipment to the field hospital in Radom. The Wehrmacht sentry who'd checked her documents an hour earlier had waved her through without interest. Just another nurse. Just another day. The fog carried sound strangely. She could hear the sentries talking near the bridge approach, their voices distorted by moisture and distance. Could hear the clank of equipment, the scrape of boots on gravel. Somewhere in the valley, a crow called. Normal. Everything normal. Then the whistle. Low at first, distant, rolling through the fog like a warning from another world. The munitions train. 12 freight cars, 3 passenger carriages for guards, 2 flatbed cars carrying anti-aircraft guns, was ahead of schedule by 17 minutes. Irina's hands tightened on the handles of her medical kit. Inside the kit, beneath a layer of bandages and sterilization equipment, sat the secondary ignition device. A small alcohol lamp used for sterilizing instruments, modified with a wick, that burned at precisely the temperature needed to ignite the backup fuse Jan had hidden in the medical crates now sitting on the bridge approach, waiting to be loaded onto the evening supply train. But they weren't waiting for evening anymore. The whistle sounded again. Closer. The fog began to thin as the locomotive's heat pushed through it, a massive shape emerging like something surfacing from deep water. Black iron. Steam. The screech of wheels on rails as it began the slight curve that would carry it onto the bridge. Irina opened her medical kit. Her hands were steady. 3 years of occupation had burned the shaking out of her. She struck the match. The sterilization lamp caught immediately, the flame invisible in the morning light, but singing the air with the smell of burning alcohol. She adjusted the wick, a gesture so practiced, so mundane, that the sentry glancing her direction simply looked away. Medical procedure. Nothing to see. The train hit the bridge. The pressure trigger armed itself beneath 400 tons of locomotive and cargo. 80 meters of track. 60. 40. Irina touched the flame to the exposed fuse cord that ran from her wagon into the drainage ditch, invisible in the tall grass. Time stopped. She could hear individual sounds. The rhythmic chuff of the locomotive's pistons, the metallic singing of wheels on rails, her own heartbeat loud enough to drown out thought. The fuse sparked, caught, began its 15-second journey toward the detonator buried in the bridge's support structure. She counted. Jeden. Dwa. Trzy. The train's whistle sounded one final time, a long, clear note of arrival. Stary. Pinch. The munitions car crossed the bridge's midpoint. Sesht. Then the world came apart. The explosion didn't sound like thunder. It sounded like the earth breaking. The bridge support erupted first, a white-hot column of force that lifted the locomotive 6 meters into the air before physics remembered which direction was down. The munitions car detonated a half-second later. Then the next. Then the next. A cascade of secondary explosions that turned 40 tons of artillery shells, rifle ammunition, and tank rounds into a fireball that punched through the fog like a small sun being born. The shockwave hit Irina's wagon, nearly tipping it. Her horse screamed and bolted. She held on, watching through watering eyes as the bridge collapsed in sections, iron, stone, and burning steel dropping into the ravine in a roar that swallowed every other sound. German guards were running, stumbling, some on fire. The passenger carriages had jackknifed, spilling soldiers into the inferno. Anti-aircraft guns fired randomly as their ammunition cooked off, tracers arcing into empty sky. From the forest edge 400 meters away, Jan and Tomasz and 6 other partisans stood frozen, watching smoke rise in a column visible for 50 kilometers. None of them moved. None of them spoke. Irina climbed down from her wagon on shaking legs. Around her, the sentries were screaming for medical assistance, for fire equipment, for explanations. She opened her medical kit, now just bandages and morphine, nothing that could tie her to the smoking crater where a bridge used to be, and walked toward the wounded. The nurse had work to do. The reprisals came within 6 hours. Wehrmacht investigators arrived from Krakow before the bridge had stopped smoking. They photographed the crater, catalogued the wreckage, interviewed the surviving sentries who swore they'd seen nothing suspicious. Just fog. Just a routine supply checkpoint. Just a nurse with proper documentation. Gone now. Vanished into the chaos after treating the wounded. By nightfall, the interrogations began. They rounded up 17 villagers. The blacksmith, the schoolteacher, the farmer who owned the land near the bridge. Men and women dragged from their homes and questioned in the burned-out shell of the railway station. The Wehrmacht captain conducting the investigation was thorough, professional, operating from a manual that assumed partisan attacks followed predictable patterns. Explosives stolen from depots, fuses made from mining equipment, operatives who left traces. But there were no traces, only questions that led nowhere. The blacksmith's welding equipment showed recent use, routine repairs on Wehrmacht vehicles, all documented. The schoolteacher's mathematics textbooks contained no formulas more dangerous than geometry. The medical supply manifests were perfect, signed by German officers, transported by German medics, every crate accounted for. On the third day, they burned Irina's clinic. Not as punishment, they still hadn't connected her to the sabotage, but as preventive security measures. The building sat too close to the railway, too convenient for future attacks. Major Kruger himself signed the demolition order, never knowing he was destroying the workshop where his own death had been assembled, one bandage roll at a time. By then, Irina was gone. She'd slipped away the night of the explosion, guided through forest paths by partisans who'd watched the bridge burn. Her medical bag, her papers, her carefully constructed identity as the cooperative village nurse. All of it left behind in the rubble. She carried nothing but the clothes she wore and the memory of Klaus, the young German medic, who'd helped load the crates and probably died in the first 3 seconds of the blast. That memory would stay with her. The oath stayed too. The German report, filed 2 weeks later, attributed the attack to unknown saboteurs, likely partisan elements disguised as agricultural workers operating from forest positions. The language was telling. Even after investigating for 14 days, even after interrogating half the village, German intelligence couldn't conceive of what had actually happened. Their categories didn't allow for it. Saboteurs were forest fighters, rural bandits, desperate men with stolen weapons. Not nurses, not medical personnel, not the mercy infrastructure they themselves had approved and documented and transported. They were still looking for farmers with pitchforks. They never found the woman with the sterilization lamp. But in the village, in whispered conversations after curfew, in coded messages passed through the remaining resistance network, the truth took root. Pielęgniarka zapaliła ląd. The nurse lit the fuse. Within a month, the story had spread through 3 counties. Within 3 months, German medical officers across occupied Poland began treating their Polish nursing staff with new suspicion, new protocols, new restrictions that made real medical care harder and partisan infiltration easier. The Wehrmacht had learned the wrong lesson. They assumed the danger was the disguise. They never understood that the disguise was the danger. The strategic impact took months to reveal itself. In December 1943, German Army Group Center requisitioned emergency ammunition shipments to replace stockpiles lost in the October railway sabotage. The request went through proper channels, was approved, and then stalled. The munitions destroyed at the Polish bridge had been earmarked for 3 separate Wehrmacht divisions, preparing for winter defensive operations along the Eastern Front. Replacing them required diverting production from other sectors, rerouting supply trains, recalculating logistics for an entire theater of war. By the time substitute ammunition reached the front lines, it was January 1944. The Red Army had already broken through at 3 critical points. German units, rationing artillery shells that should have been plentiful, were forced into tactical withdrawals that became full retreats. 1 destroyed train, 400 tons of ordnance, the cascading failure of a supply chain that had assumed the railways were secure because the people operating them were harmless. Military historians would later debate how much impact a single act of sabotage could have on such a massive front. The consensus was inconclusive. Wars aren't won or lost by individual operations. But supply officers who'd lived through that winter knew differently. They remembered the desperate requests, the makeshift rationing, the attacks they couldn't support because the ammunition that should have been in their depots was buried in a Polish ravine. 1 nurse, 1 bridge, 1 moment when invisible resistance became devastating reality. Irina Kowalska never returned to her village. After the war, Polish authorities attempted to document partisan activities for historical records. They found her name on a Wehrmacht medical registry dated September 1943, found the burned remains of her clinic, found witness testimony that she'd been present during the incident and had provided medical assistance to German casualties. But after October 23, 1943, there was nothing. No further records, no death certificate, no post-war registration. She had vanished as completely as if the explosion had consumed her along with the bridge. Some said she'd been killed in a later German reprisal. Others claimed she'd emigrated after liberation, changing her name, disappearing into the anonymous multitudes of displaced persons flooding through Europe in 1945. A few believed she'd simply walked away from the resistance, from the war, from the identity that had required her to weaponize the very compassion she'd sworn to uphold. The truth, if it still existed, died with the people who knew it. In 1967, a West German documentary team interviewed former Wehrmacht officers about partisan warfare. One of them, a logistics captain who'd served in Poland, recalled the railway incident with something close to wonder. "We had protocols," he said, speaking in the careful, measured tone of a man revisiting decisions made decades earlier. "We documented everything: medical supplies, personnel, transport routes. We thought we understood the threat: bandits in the forests, saboteurs at the depots. We built our security around visible resistance." He paused, looking at something beyond the camera. "They told us the locals were farmers, peasants, too frightened to fight, too simple to threaten us. We believed it because we wanted to believe it, because believing otherwise would have meant questioning every interaction, suspecting every face, treating mercy itself as potential danger." Another pause. Longer. "But their nurse," he said quietly, "was more dangerous than our tanks." The Wehrmacht had mistaken Irina's mercy for weakness, her healing for harmlessness, her visibility for transparency. They had built an empire on the assumption that occupation bred submission, that the powerless would remain powerless, that a nurse with clean hands couldn't also be a saboteur with a lit fuse. They were wrong, and in occupied Poland, where ordinary people fought an empire with nothing but intelligence, courage, and the willingness to hide revolution inside routine, mercy became the sharpest weapon anyone had ever wielded. It just looked like bandages and compassion. Until it didn't.